The sun was starting to set over the wide, empty plains. The air was warm, and the sounds of the wind brushing past the tall grass filled the air. Thomas, a solitary cowboy, had just finished the last of his work for the day. He was tall, with rough hands from years of working the ranch. His face was weathered, and his hair, though thick and dark, had begun to show hints of gray. But there was kindness in his eyes, a softness that came from years of living alone and helping those in need. The ranch was quiet, as it often was. Thomas had always preferred it that way. He didn't mind the silence. The solitude gave him time to think, to reflect on the years that had passed since he left the bustling towns behind. He had settled on this piece of land, determined to make a life for himself far from the noise and distractions of the world. It was peaceful here, but peace, he knew, didn't always last. As he prepared to sit down for a quiet meal in his small cabin, there was a sudden knock at the door. It was a soft knock, almost hesitant, but it was enough to make Thomas pause. He wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, and no one ever really visited his ranch. Not anymore, at least. For a moment, he simply stared at the door, wondering if he had imagined it. But then the knock came again, more urgent this time. He stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, and walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, he was met with the sight of a woman standing on his porch. She looked like she had been traveling for days, and she appeared exhausted. Her clothes were torn, and there was a wildness in her eyes. She was thin, almost too thin, and her face was covered in dust. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in a long time. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice hoarse. I don't know where else to go." Thomas studied her for a moment. There was something about her that seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. He knew that people in these parts didn't just wander the plains without a reason. Something had brought her here, and by the look in her eyes, it wasn't good. "You're welcome to come inside," Thomas said, his voice calm and steady. "You look like you've been on a rough journey." The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously over her shoulder, before she stepped inside. Thomas led her to the small kitchen where he had a pot of stew warming on the stove. He pulled out a chair for her, and she sank into it with a tired sigh. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to show up like this, but I didn't know who else to turn to." "No need to explain," Thomas said. "You're safe here. What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied quietly. "My name is Sarah." Thomas nodded and set a bowl of stew in front of her. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, as if she wasn't sure whether to eat or not. But the smell of the warm food seemed to pull her out of her shell, and she slowly began to eat. As she ate, Thomas couldn't help but notice that her hands were trembling. She was doing her best to control it, but it was obvious that something was deeply wrong. He wanted to ask her what had happened, but he knew better than to push someone when they weren't ready to talk. Sometimes people needed time to find their words. After she had eaten, Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sadness. "I'm sorry to be a burden," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But I've been running for a long time. I don't know where else to go." "You're no burden," Thomas said, his voice gentle. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. But if you want to, you can tell me what happened. Sometimes it helps to talk." Sarah shook her head, her eyes downcast. For a moment she said nothing, as though she were trying to find the right words. Finally she spoke again, her voice breaking. "I'm not clean anymore," she said, her voice barely audible. "I've done things, terrible things, and now I don't know who I am anymore." Thomas felt a pang of sympathy for her, though he didn't fully understand what she meant. He could see the fear in her eyes, and he could sense that whatever she had been through, it had torn her apart. "You're safe here, Sarah," he said gently. "Whatever's happened, it's behind you now. You don't have to carry it with you anymore." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. She seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as though deciding whether she could trust him. After a long pause, she finally spoke again, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can ever forget what's happened to me," she whispered, "but I can't go back. I can't face what's waiting for me if I go back. I just wanted to be free. I wanted to be a person again." Thomas sat down across from her, his expression softening. "You don't have to worry about that anymore," he said. "You're free now, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to. We can figure out what comes next together." For the first time since she had arrived, Sarah let out a shaky breath, almost as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She gave him a small, tentative smile, The kind of smile that someone gives when they're not sure if they can trust it yet. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she said quietly. "You won't have to," Thomas replied. "We'll figure it out together." As Sarah settled into the cabin, the weight of her past seemed to hang heavily in the air. But for now she was safe, and that was all that mattered. As the evening wore on, Thomas quietly went about his tasks, giving her space to rest. But as he glanced over at her, sitting by the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much deeper at play here. A secret that Sarah was carrying, one that would eventually come to light. But for now, he would keep his promise. He would protect her as best as he could from whatever had brought her to this place, and he would help her heal, one step at a time. As the night settled in and the stars twinkled in the sky above, Thomas felt a quiet resolve within him. He didn't know the full story yet, but he would soon, and when he did, he would be ready to help Sarah face it just as he had promised. The next morning, Sarah woke early, her body stiff from the exhaustion of the previous days. The warmth of the cabin and the gentle light streaming through the window made her feel safe, but she couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety that lingered deep inside her. It wasn't just the physical pain she had endured. It was the emotional weight that seemed to sit on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Thomas had already left to tend to the horses, and the quiet of the cabin gave Sarah the time she needed to think. She had been running for so long that it felt strange to sit still, to rest. It was as if her body didn't know how to relax anymore. She stood up slowly, careful not to wake Thomas's dog, which lay curled up by the hearth. The fire had burned low in the grate, and Sarah took a moment to stoke it back to life, the sound of the crackling wood soothing her nerves. She had to admit the simplicity of this life was unlike anything she had known before. Here, in this small cabin with a man who offered nothing but kindness, she could almost forget the horrors of her past. Almost. But the memories were never far away. As Sarah moved around the room, she caught sight of herself in the mirror hanging above the small washstand. Her reflection startled her. She looked different, thin, tired, haunted. There were shadows under her eyes, and her once beautiful hair was tangled and messy. She felt like a stranger in her own skin. She reached for a brush on the counter, trying to make herself presentable, but as she brushed through her hair, her hands trembled. The thought of looking someone in the eye, especially Thomas, filled her with dread. What would he think of her when he learned the truth? When she told him what had happened, would he still see her as the woman who had knocked on his door, desperate and broken? Or would he see her as the person she had become, a shell of the woman she once was? Just then, the door creaked open and Thomas stepped in. His rough boots left marks in the dirt as he entered, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft whinny of a horse in the distance. "Morning," he said with a warm smile, his voice low and steady. He looked at her with kindness in his eyes, as if he saw right through her unease. "I made you some coffee." Sarah turned to him, startled by the kindness in his voice. She had grown so used to people looking past her, ignoring her, that it almost felt unnatural to have someone speak to her this way. She nodded and walked toward the small kitchen, trying to push her thoughts aside. "Thank you," she said softly, taking the cup he handed her. The warmth of the coffee felt good in her hands, and the rich smell filled the air, momentarily distracting her from the mess of emotions swirling inside. Thomas didn't sit right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching her quietly as if he were waiting for something. Sarah could feel his gaze on her, but she couldn't meet it. She looked down at her coffee, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Sarah," Thomas said, breaking the silence, "you don't have to tell me what happened. Not yet, anyway. But if you do, when you're ready, I'll be here." She swallowed hard, the words she had been holding back for so long bubbling to the surface. She wanted to tell him everything, to explain the darkness she had been running from. But the fear, the shame, it held her back. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at the coffee cup in her hands. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know where to begin." Thomas took a step closer, his voice gentle. "Start with what you can." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't something she had ever planned on sharing with anyone, especially not a stranger. But there was something about Thomas's quiet strength, his patience, that made her feel as though she could trust him. "I grew up in a small town," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father was a wealthy rancher, and I lived a life that many would envy. I was a child of privilege, but I didn't know what true hardship was until I was sold. She paused, struggling to hold back tears. I wasn't just sold as property. I was promised to a man I didn't even know. Her hands shook as she set the coffee cup down on the table. She didn't look at Thomas. She couldn't. But she could feel his presence, steady and unwavering, as he waited for her to continue. He was cruel. Sarah continued, her voice tight with emotion. Not just to me, but to everyone around him. I thought I could escape him, that I could outrun my fate, but when I tried to leave, he caught me. She closed her eyes, the memory of the moment still fresh in her mind. The fear, the helplessness. It was a feeling she would never forget. I thought I was going to die out there, alone in the wilderness. She paused, the weight of the memory almost too much to bear. I thought the only way out was to end it all. But then I heard a voice calling to me, telling me I could be free. That voice, it was his. He told me I would be his forever, that there was no escape. So I ran. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by her weakness. She didn't want Thomas to see her like this. She didn't want to be pitied, but Thomas didn't pity her. He simply sat across from her, his face calm and kind. I don't know if I'll ever feel clean again, she whispered. I don't know if I'll ever feel like I'm worth anything. Thomas didn't speak right away. He simply watched her, as if considering her words. Finally, he said, I don't think it's about being clean in the way you think. It's about healing. And that takes time. But you don't have to do it alone. You're here now, and you don't need to carry that weight anymore. Sarah looked up at him, her heart filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. Could it really be that simple? Could she actually be free of the past that haunted her? I don't know how to move on, she said softly, her voice barely audible. But I want to try. You'll take it one day at a time, Thomas replied. And when you need help, you ask. I'm here. You don't have to face this alone. Sarah felt a small spark of hope, a light she hadn't felt in so long. She wasn't sure if she could fully trust that hope yet. But it was a start. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt as though maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life. She could move forward. Thomas stood up and went to the door. I'm going to check on the horses. You stay here, get some rest. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Thomas gave her one last look before he left, and Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the empty cup before her. The warmth of the fire and the quiet of the cabin surrounded her, and for the first time, she didn't feel completely lost. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't running anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she had found the courage to face whatever came next.